was perhaps 20 years ago, and was certainly 20 years ago. Of course, the US, it's the mantra of the Trump administration is make America great again. It has become much more concerned about what happens within its national boundaries than becoming this sort of important member, critical contributor to the international effort, and that is having real consequences on the ground in these countries. And I think the bigger picture is the political obstructionism towards recognizing the importance of climate change, and that understanding that these extreme weather events are not just throws of the dice by a deity. These are man-made disasters as a result of climate change, and au contraire, we're not going to see any man-made response working until we start looking at the ways of minimizing the damage in the first place that's causing these things. So we're going to see a combination of more floods, more extreme weather, more cyclones, and so on, at the same time as we're seeing droughts and devastation. And so we've got these two contrary things going on. We've got this devastating cyclone coming in from the Indian Ocean, laying waste to vast areas of Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. At the same time, a devastating drought is hitting these areas and disrupting farming. So the farmers of the area are being hit by two apparently contrary forces, floods and drought at the same time. And of course, this is the planting season. So the human and economic implications of this disaster are going to be that much more serious. So I think it really does again make the point for a much more joined up approach to tackling climate change and mitigating it in terms of defenses and early warning.
Is there a country on the continent which stands out by its forward thinking in this respect? Because I mean, there are plenty of countries in the Sahel or who border the Sahel who will be facing these problems increasingly over the next couple of decades. Are there any success stories that we can point to and say, look, here's someone doing something interesting?
I think there are a lot of groups across Africa doing extremely important work. I mean, on climate change, responses to climate change, and trying to mitigate the worst effects. I mean, in that particular region, Botswana has been doing a lot of work, and it should be said also South Africa. The energy sector in South Africa has been lambasted at the moment because of Eskom, the state power utilities failure. But don't forget, South Africa is building up a powerful sector of solar power and wind power electricity generation, and you're seeing a lot of that. You're seeing that also in Namibia. Now further north, I guess Kenya and Ethiopia are also investing in solar power in a big way. I think it's going to be very, very important there. Senegal too. And of course, the country near to your heart, Morocco, has done an enormous amount of work on solar power and is now talking about solar power farms. There are these Pan-African initiatives, some through the African Union, some through ECOWAS, talking about green corridors running through Africa. Ghana, again, is doing work on sustainable energy, solar power. The organizations in Ghana making the links between solar power and mobile telephony, saying that we can have this sort of decentralized off-grid units of solar power that will enable us to sort of leapfrog over our sort of big energy inefficiencies and lack of power. So I think right across the continent there are these efforts and initiatives. I guess what is missing is a sense of emergency to join them all up and to really attract the investment. And I think that goes back to the global initiatives, the climate change conferences, where you get countries like India and China are very, very well organized in their plans and strategy to mitigate the effects of climate change. So they go to the international conference with a series of very well formulated demands in terms of funding and collaboration, and they come out, with great successes. You're not seeing that so much on the African side, that the African governments and agencies like the African Union, the African Development Bank, are not getting enough from these international organizations, from particularly the climate change conferences, the succession of climate change conferences we've seen. Last week, we saw the big conference in Nairobi, Kenya, climate change conference, addressed by Emmanuel Macron and a group of regional African leaders. And you sense that this is still seen as one of the many issues that have to be tackled, instead of perhaps one of the most devastating threats. And I think it does, go back to the floods and the cyclone. We see the headlines, and then after that, the attention span leaps to another crisis or issue. We're not getting this continuing pressure on climate change that we need.
One of our colleagues was speculating recently that just as no one really predicted the economic impact that mobile phones would have on Africa, and they were so quickly adopted in the late 90s, early 2000s. Perhaps we have a similar blind spot when it comes to the economic impact of solar power on the continent, and that, just to finish on perhaps whatever positive note we can in what is obviously a terrible situation in the south of the continent. But don't you think there is a potential that with massive rural uptake of solar panels, you can get use of the water table? You can use solar pumps. You can start irrigating in places that haven't really been irrigated in before. Israel has got great, technology to turn the desert into bloom. I don't see why that can't be generalized across the continent. Yeah. And what you need for that is power. Powered irrigation absolutely changes the soil composition of entire areas. There's a relatively thin population in Africa. Everyone, there's a great massive of debate about demographics in Africa, and in the background of worried Eurocrats, there are waves of immigration crashing onto Europe's shores. But actually, if you look at the data, Africa is very sparsely populated. And if you now have a technology where you can regreen whole areas, Africa might actually be the solution for climate change. There's no better carbon sink than a plant.
Right.
And if solar energy can be used to green the continent, Africa will become the carbon sink of the world.
No, 100%. And I think that could be accentuating the positives and the ways of bouncing back from this. It's got to be the route. Tropical rainforest, sure, it's taken thousands of years to develop, but the situation can be ameliorated. New tree planting, a mass program of tree planting. So very simple strategy, but very effective, certainly in changing the dial on climate change. As you said, Africa, more than perhaps any continent on Earth, has the capacity to be self-sufficient in solar power, and we're looking at very fast-moving technology, both in terms of its capacity to gather the sun and harness the sun, and so the generating power of the solar power units, but also actually the storage power, which is improving very, very fast. We're also talking about the continent that produces over 50% of the world's cobalt, which is the key ingredient in electric cars. all over Europe, you're seeing people buzzing around on electric bikes now, on electric scooters. That could come to Africa, very, very quickly. It could come today, in fact, and I think it probably will. So I think you're looking at a lot of the solutions to climate change in Africa, perversely. But I think what there isn't enough focus on right now is that when people talk about climate change as this global threat, which it surely is, there's not enough focus on Africa is the first line of global defenses against climate change. So getting it right in Africa, getting a really strong, robust response to the threat of climate change in Africa is absolutely essential. And I think one good use of this crisis in Mozambique is to point this out, that the extreme weather and the devastating floods and droughts that accompany it are a sign of the threat of climate change, and it needs to be taken very seriously. And Africa's the place to do it.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. You can see all our latest stories on www.theafricareport.com. Come join the conversation. We're on Twitter @TheAfricaReport and on Facebook by the same name. I'm @Nick Norbrook. Thanks for listening.